All right, so we on Monday we talked about functions. Today we're talking about adding HTML elements into a P5 sketch. They're not actually all that related, but they work together nicely because we can use our functions along with our P5 or HTML elements to give the user an interface to work with. So we're going to just add that in. So we're talking about the document object model a little bit, and this is actually, if you were writing vanilla JavaScript, like regular JavaScript, this is something you'd spend a lot more time working with than in P5. So I'm going to kind of be going back and forth. I'm going to go over here and open up my example from Monday. Loop plus function. Okay. And so on Monday, I created this example where I have a little loop and I'm using a function to create this interactive self-portrait that I can click on, and it creates it kind of changes the expression. But actually, I want to work with a different one. I'm going to go back to my previous one, actually. Let's go to, I'll just use the loop plus random. I'm going to duplicate this and add the buttons in here. So I'm going to duplicate, and this will be my DOM example. So in here, I'm going to say adding DOM elements to generate pattern. And I'll put the date. And so I'm going to take out some of the stuff that's already in here that we don't really need anymore. So I'll take out this loop comment. And I'm going to take out all these different examples that I was adding in here. And so we have this generative pattern. When we run it, it looks a little bit different each time. And I'm going to add in a couple of interface elements so that if I was going to present this to somebody, like if I shared the full screen version, they can't really do anything with the project as is. So what I want to do is create some buttons that they can click to save the image or change the pattern. And you can use the buttons to do anything. This is just kind of an example of one thing that you could do with them. And so what we're actually doing is a little bit different than what we've done before. We're going to be interacting with the document object model. So we kind of talked about this like in the very, very first JavaScript lesson when we typed in document to the console, and you see the HTML document, and we can make changes to it using JavaScript. This is what JavaScript is actually used for, like most of the time. If you're not creating like a game or some cool visual project, you're usually updating elements inside the HTML to make dynamic content. So it's really useful for a website that has lots of changes that are happening, something like Twitter or Facebook, something where the information is constantly changing, as opposed to a website that just has text. So we can actually add HTML into our document if we want to. We can open up our file system in P5 and go to index.html. If I want to have a button in here, I can just write some HTML. I can say, here's a button. Hey, how's it going? And I can write click me. And if I rerun my sketch, you'll see there's an HTML button up here. So it's not actually part of my canvas. So we can actually just go into the HTML and add it there. But since we're working in P5, if we want to stay in P5 and if we want our P5 sketch to interact with the button, it can be easier to add stuff from our sketch. So that's kind of what these DOM functions that we're going to look at today will help us do. And if we want to look at these in the reference, they're under DOM here. So you can see all of these different things that we can do. We can create a button. We can create an image tag. We can create a paragraph. We can create a div. All of this stuff lets us interact with the actual HTML document of the website. So let's start with a button. It's pretty easy to create a button. I'm going to set this up a little bit. So one thing that I did when I was working on this design is I put no loop in here so that I wouldn't be just getting tons and tons of copies of this thing. But if we take that out, you'll see the sketch goes kind of crazy because it's just all the random generation is happening every single frame. And so it's kind of wild. It's not really very practical. So what I could do instead of calling the draw function, which is our built-in P5 function that's always running, I could change the name of this function. I'll call it pattern. So now it's not going to run at all, but I can call the pattern function from setup. And so now it'll run once when we start the program. And so it's going to draw my stuff, but it doesn't keep going. So it only runs one time. And we don't even have a draw loop at all anymore, which is fine. We don't need one if there's no reason for it. So we can call this pattern function. And now what I want to do is give the user the ability to call it again. So remember, if I present this to somebody, if they're not in the editor view, if they're on a website, this is what they're going to see. And there's no instructions to say this is how you replay it or whatever. So we need to give them an interface to work with. So if I want to create a button, it's pretty easy to do. I can just use the function create button. And then I can put some text in the button. So I can say generate new pattern so that they know what the button does. Okay, so there's the button. It's in our HTML. And if we look at the source for this page, you can see, oh, actually, we don't see it in the source because it's added by JavaScript, so it's not in the original source. But if we inspect the HTML, it's kind of hard to see because there's a lot of stuff going on. But here's the body of this page, and here's this section, and there's the button that got added. So JavaScript is actually adding the button into the HTML. So we do want this button to do something. So we have to attach it to some function. And that's actually really easy to do in JavaScript. We can assign the button to a variable, and then we can use mouse pressed to attach a function to that variable. So let's assign the button first. I'm going to say variable pattern button equals create button. I'm running out of space, so my font is kind of big. Make the font just a little bit smaller. Okay, so I have my pattern button now, and so now I want to attach it to my pattern function. So I'm going to say pattern button, and then if I say dot on, or no, it's just mouse press, sorry, mouse pressed. So this is just like our mouse press function that we've used in the past, but now it's associated with this button. So it only works on this button. It doesn't happen if we click somewhere else. And then what I'm going to do is just put this function pattern into the parentheses for mouse pressed. And this is called the callback function in JavaScript. It's a very common pattern because we are often capturing events from the user, like a mouse press or a key press, and then we're doing something based on that event. And so we put in a function, which is a callback function that basically says, once this mouse is pressed, this is the function that you're going to run. And so we're going to run our pattern function again. So I just have to put the function in there like that. I don't need the parentheses because we're not actually running the function. We're just using a reference to that function. So it's kind of like here, I actually have to call pattern. I have to put the parentheses afterwards. That tells JavaScript I actually want you to do everything that's inside the pattern function. But here, this isn't happening right now. This is happening in the future. So I'm basically saying, when this mouse press thing happens, this is the function that I want to run. So now if I play, you can see that generate pattern button works. And if I go to my full screen page, So now my user has something to interact with in my sketch. Cool, so let's add a couple more, let's add one more button and then we'll do some styling. And so for this button, we're gonna save an image. So usually we do this by adding something to the mouse press, but we can actually add a button here so our user can save their own image. And we can do it basically the exact same way. So I start with create a button and I'm gonna say save image. So that creates the button, but it doesn't do anything. So if we wanted to do something, we have to assign it to a variable. So we're going to say save button equals create button save image. And so now we don't actually have a function to save the image in our code, but we can just use, actually, what did I use here? Oh yeah, because I wanted to name it. Okay. So I could say this if I was, didn't care that much. I could say save button dot mouse pressed, and then I could just use the built-in save function right here as a callback, and I think that'll work. But it's just going to be called untitled.png because I didn't have a place to put an argument. And so that's one disadvantage here is if my function has an argument, then I need to be able to call it. And there's actually a couple different ways to do this. I can actually write a whole function into these parentheses. I don't normally do it like that because it's kind of confusing to look at. But I can actually do this. I can write a whole function. See how I have like function, pattern, blah, blah, blah. I can write a whole function here as the callback function. And this is an anonymous function. It doesn't have a name. And I don't actually really recommend doing this, but you will see it a lot in JavaScript code. So it's a good thing to kind of go over it. So now I can say save pattern.png. And I want to save a PNG. It's going to be a higher quality image. So if a user is using it, I want them to get a better quality image. So I'm going to run this again and click save image. And there's our pattern.png. And that's going to be in the downloads folder. So that looks pretty good. Looks better than these JPEGs that we saved in that earlier video. Okay, so this is a callback function stuck directly into the argument of our mouse pressed event. As I mentioned, you will see this in a lot of JavaScript examples, but it's not the prettiest way to write code. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to cut this out of here. I'm going to stick it down here, and let's give it a name. So if we want our function down here, we have to give it a name. So I'm going to call it save pattern image. And now I can just take the name of this function and put it into our event. And that looks much nicer than what we had before, where you're reading through this function that's inside of another argument. So now I have save button, mouse pressed. I have a nice simple argument, save pattern image. Here's my save pattern image function, and this just saves the pattern. So I can generate some patterns and I can save new images. Okay, so that's pretty cool. As I mentioned, you can use buttons to do lots of different stuff. They don't only, these aren't the only uses for these buttons, but this is just an example. Let's style up our buttons a little bit. So since we are using HTML, we can also use CSS. Oh, actually, this is a little. Oh, I have a whole other. Okay, let's do the CSS styling, and then we'll come back to this part. So I can add CSS styling directly into my CSS document over here. So the buttons are pretty small. If I just add some basic CSS, I can say button. This will apply to any of my buttons. So let's make the font size bigger. Let's say the font size is 2EM. So now it's nice and big. We can give the border, let's say like the border is 2 pixels solid blue. That'll stand out a little bit better. Border radius. I'm just kind of adding some random stuff in here. Say 0.25 for the border radius. Actually doesn't really look that good against the black background that I'm using. So let's use a white border. And let's do a little bit of padding so they're not just standing on top of each other. So I'll say padding is like 3 pixels. That wasn't really enough. Oh, I mean margin. Oops. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Maybe let's make the background of the button black and the color white. Okay, that's starting to look a little bit better. So we can style the button here just directly in the CSS if we want to. But we can also add style through JavaScript. So just like there's some JavaScript functions to create the button, we can also do some styling with JavaScript. Oh, I didn't put that in here. Okay, we'll position it next. So if I wanted the buttons to have like 2 different styles instead of like the generic style, I could say like pattern button .css, and I think it's .css. Let me double check the reference. It might be .style. Select the change. Oh, I actually don't see it on here. Let's look in the P5 element. Oh yeah, it's part of this element. So let's see. Let's find style. There it is. Okay, it's actually called style, not CSS. Okay. So we can say style, and then we can add 2 arguments. One is a property for the style. So let's change the color of this one, and then the color that we want. So let's make this one red. Okay, so now we have the generate new pattern button. I don't really like the red here. Let's do plum. Okay, that looks better. And then we can have our save button be a different color. Save button dot style, and you can do this with any CSS style. So for the color, let's do this one light blue. That'll look nice. Okay, that's pretty good. So the buttons still work. Okay, so then the last bit that I want to do is positioning the buttons. So by default, because these guys are inside of our HTML, let's actually look at the inspector over here on this one, because I think this will be simpler. No, it's not simpler. It's still in an iframe. Oh, wow. So it's just loading it into this. Okay. That's fine, whatever. So if we look in here, you can see the way that P5 creates a sketch. There's this like main here, and then there's the canvas, and then there's the buttons, and they're down here. And so we can't really combine them together because they're not in the same place. So what we can do is get a reference to this main div, this main element that gets added to, and then use that for some positioning. So I think this is actually a little bit different. It used to create this div ID equals sketch, but it doesn't really look like it does that anymore. Let's check P5 and see. I bet they have a way of doing that now. So I'll say P5 reference main elements. Okay, so P5 creates main. How do I prevent that? Oh, wow, this is... You know what? I think I can do this in a better way. This is a little bit different than when I wrote these notes, but that's okay. So let's get a reference to our canvas. So I'm going to say let canvas equal create canvas. And then I think what we can do, I'm going to log the canvas real quick. I think what we can do is get the parent element of the canvas, and that should be the main element that P5 creates. Let's see if it's in here. Child HTML. I don't see it. Okay, let's go back to the reference and look for a parent. Oh, yeah, it's right here. Okay, parent. Okay, so this will give us the parent of the canvas. So parent. And that's that main div with the canvas in it. So what we want to do is actually put our buttons inside that main div so we can do some styling relative to the main div. So let's say let parent equal canvas.parent. And then we want to put the buttons inside the parent. So we probably need to, how do we do that? Oh, how did that, let's see if oh, we can use, oh. Okay, let's see if that works. I don't know if that'll work. No, I don't think this is going to work. I think they changed this. So let's say pattern button.parent is parent. Did that work? Okay, let's log. Okay, here's our main div, here's our canvas, and here's our button. Okay, nice, that actually works. So I guess it'll get the parent or set the parent, so then we can save button dot parent is parent. Okay, so now the buttons are both inside of our main div, and now we can do some styling. So the way that we can do that, this is a little bit tricky, but what we want to do first is go to style, and we need to say the main position is relative. You guys might remember this from like MMP 100 or something, but if we want to position these guys inside of here, we have to say first that the main parent has relative position, and then we can absolute position our buttons. So if I say position is absolute in here, now we can see the buttons are in the same place. And if I say like top is 0, they'll be at the top. And then I can change the, let's say the default is left is 0. And then I'll go back to sketch and I'll say save button dot style right is 0. And I have to unset the, actually, let's not set the default because then I'm just unsetting it. So let's get rid of this one. Sorry, this is a little more convoluted than I planned, but now we can put the save button on the right by setting the absolute position. Although it's sticking out, oh, we need to set the width. Okay. So then let's take the pattern button. Oh, actually already is sitting on the left, so let's not worry about that. So then last little thing, I can actually take the parent and set the width to our canvas width so it doesn't get any bigger. So I'll say parent.style, and I'll set width to width. Or actually I have to add pixels. Oh, I got an error. They made this so much more complicated. Parent.style is not a function. Huh. So I guess it's not an element. Okay, so let's just get rid of that. And we'll just set it, we'll just hard code it for now. So I'll say width is 600 pixels. There we go. Okay, so you don't actually need to do this, but if you really wanted to, this is how you could style your buttons to be inside of your sketch. And you can do that with other HTML elements. You can do it with other canvases. Like you can do that with a lot of stuff. Again, it's not really necessary. If you like having the buttons down here, that's totally fine as well. That's just an option. All right, I'm going to quickly go over the last little bit, but I think this is plenty to cover for tonight. So there's a few other types of HTML inputs that might be useful depending on what you are working on. So one of those, okay, we added the button. So you can also create sliders using a little slider. And so let's say we wanted to change some value, like how far away our guys are on the canvas. So we could use a slider so the user could actually change this 80 value, right? So if I change the 80 value, it spaces out my characters more or closer, but I could give the user the ability to change this value. And this is actually really useful. You could change colors, you could change all sorts of different stuff with this. But it requires a little bit of setup. So the first thing that I need is actually a reference to save the slider. So I created my buttons inside of setup because once I create them, I don't really need to reference them later. But for my slider, I actually need to get the value out of the slider later. So the first thing I need to do is create a variable to hold the slider. So I'm going to say let, what am I changing here? I'm changing like the number of self-portraits in my pattern. So I'm going to say let num self-portraits. This is like a typical programming shorthand for like the number of, just num self-portraits. And it's that is 80. And then I need a slider, so num self-portraits slider. This is kind of a long variable name, but that one we don't need to change. I'm actually kind of doing, okay, there's a couple different ways. Actually, you know what, this is probably smarter. Let's just have a number. So I'm going to put this number. Oh, no, but I'm still going to need to. Okay, I think this will work. I'm just going to put this number here. And then I can put the rest of the code, I think, in setup. So that's the number of self-portraits. And if I want to change it, I'll create a slider. So I'll say variable num self-portraits slider equals create slider. And the slider is a little bit more complicated than the button because it's not just an event that does one thing. It actually has like multiple inputs that we need to know about. So one of them is where the slider starts, like the minimum value. It's a little bit like the map function. Then the next one is how high the slider goes. And then the last one is where it starts. So for this one, let's say the minimum, we can't do 0 because then our for loop will break and that'll be bad. So let's say the minimum is 10. And let's say the maximum is like 200. I think that should be fine. We can always change it later. And let's start it at 80 because that's where it starts already. And so now we can say num self portraits slider dot I think what's the function for this? Input. So the instead of mouse pressed, what we use here is just input. So anything that changes, we can put in here. And so now we can write a function here, and we just need to reference this. So that's why I wanted to put it outside. So yeah, that's why we need it over here. So let's say, because I could write a callback function directly in here, but then that would kind of go against what I was saying earlier, which is that that looks bad. So let's make a reference here. Then I'll take out this var so that now we have this slider, but we still have a reference to the slider. globally. And let's add a new function. So the function is change num self-portraits. I guess update is probably, yeah, let's do update. So that's our new function. I'm going to copy that down here and say function. So yeah, creating an interface is a bit more complicated than some of the other stuff we've done. I'm also making these function names extremely verbose. But now all we have to do is set our num self-portraits to our num self-portrait slider dot value. And that's going to give us the value of the slider. Oops. So let's run this. So here you see the slider. And if I go all the way down here, the number, so it's actually kind of the opposite, because the lower the number is, actually the more self-portraits there are. So that's kind of a bad naming job. But you can see if I go all the way up, this is really the distance between self-portraits. There's only a few of them over here. And in the middle, there's a bunch of them. And all the way over here, there's like a ton of them. Another thing I could do is just call the pattern function every time I move it, so that I don't have to click generate again. So now I can kind of see what's happening as I'm sliding the slider. And so again, this is like an interface component. So instead of like saying move your mouse around or whatever, you can give somebody this slider. And so your user can actually, oh, it's not letting me. How come it won't let me? That's weird. I don't know why. Let's save it again. I'm not sure why I'm getting that weird. There we go. Okay, so I must have not saved it. So now our user can try a pattern like this or a pattern like this and click generate to make new ones, click save image. So the slider is pretty useful for that. You can also use it for colors. You could use it for anything that has a number that you want to map to. So it's a little bit like the map function. Oh, I did it a lot more simply here. I just put the value right into it. That's actually a better way to do it. You can save. Oh yeah, this is actually so much simpler. In the example. Okay, what I did in the example is I just put the value directly here. And that looks kind of crazy. But now I don't have to deal with this function. I can just call the pattern. Oh, it's not, it doesn't like something. Okay, I don't know why. I'm just going to leave it the way it is. Okay, so one more type of input I'll show real quick is a text input where your user can actually write stuff into the document. So for this one, we probably need another variable. So let's create, say, let name input. So if we want our user to be able to put their name in, we can say we need a reference to this one globally as well. So I'm going to initialize it up here, and then I'll create it down here. So I'll say let name input gets create input. And then the text I put here is what shows up inside the input box, like a placeholder. So I'll say input your name. Okay, and so now people can write here whatever they want. So, you could get them to input whatever. And then we could take that value and we can use it to, change the pattern name or show it on the screen. So we could say text name input dot value, and let's put it in the middle. Doesn't really go along with the pattern, but just to demonstrate that we can do that. Okay, so for some reason it does not like my getting the value. Okay, I have name input here. This happened with the other thing I was trying to do. Name input equals create input. So let's see, what is name input? Maybe they changed it from dot value to something else. It's undefined. Okay, how's that possible? So calling setup, I'm calling pattern. Oh, okay. Actually, this is a good thing to go over. So the reason I'm getting that error is because I'm calling pattern here before I actually create all of my stuff. And so what's happening is when it goes through the pattern and it's trying to use name input.value, getting an error because name input wasn't defined before I called the function here. So to fix this, all I need to do is call pattern at the very bottom. Now it should be fine. So you can see input your name there, and I can say hello. And now when I generate a new pattern, there's my name. So the user can add in data that way. And obviously I can style stuff and do more interesting stuff there. In this context, it probably makes more sense to use it somewhere like here. So instead of pattern.jpg, or I'll leave pattern in there, but I could say like name input.value plus pattern.jpg. So that way, maybe instead of like naming, a person, I can say name the pattern. And so then the user can say my cool pattern. And then if I click save image, we actually see that value in the file name, my cool pattern. So again, it's just a way of getting input from the user. You can use it for lots of different purposes. Okay, I think that's good enough. I think that covers everything. So yeah, this stuff is not like directly related to kind of the main topic of this week, which is using functions to change the way that the pattern works. But it goes together well because obviously when we're using these DOM elements, we need to connect them to functions. So it's good to be talking about how functions work and what functions are at the same time. So for the next assignment, the way that this needs to be implemented is basically your second pattern may look very similar to your first pattern. You don't actually have to change the pattern itself. You can if you want to, but there's two parts of the functionality that need to be added in. One is a couple of buttons for the user to save and regenerate the pattern. And then the other thing is just adding the custom function that we covered on Monday. So that's not actually being done here, but it's pretty easy. If I wanted to do that here, I would just have to take this whole thing and put it in a function. Although technically it is in a pattern function, which is technically a custom function. So yeah, you could probably do it that way too. But the one I did on Monday, the only real difference is, let's take a look at that. Loop plus function. So there's a self-portrait function inside of the loop that's drawing a self-portrait. So this is kind of like has a slightly different functionality because this one's interactive. But for the assignment, the main thing is just to use the buttons just to, work on that, and then add in the custom function when you're drawing the pattern. All right, I'm going to stop there.